A shattered reflection. In the bustling heart of downtown Ashtonville, a towering structure of glass and steel stood as a symbol of prosperity and stability. Summit Horizon Bank, established over a century ago, had weathered wars, economic collapses, and shifts in societal tides. Yet, as the economic downturn gripped the nation, even the mightiest of institutions felt the tremors. The bank's pristine image was now tainted by whispers of its decline. Inside the boardroom on the 15th floor, the air was heavy with desperation. The executive team, led by CEO Margaret Collins, convened to discuss the impending crisis. Their situation was dire. Within weeks, the bank would be insolvent unless they secured an investment of $1.5 billion. Margaret, a seasoned banker with decades of experience, felt the weight of the institution's history pressing on her shoulders. Hundreds of employees depended on the bank for their livelihoods, and the community relied on it as a lifeline. "There's no magic solution," Margaret stated, her tone calm, but her eyes betraying her exhaustion. "We've reached out to every possible investor. No one wants to throw money into what they see as a sinking ship." The room fell silent. Henry Park, the chief financial officer, leaned forward. "There's still one option. What about Walter Brooks? He's known for taking risks on failing companies." Margaret's eyes narrowed. Walter Brooks, the enigmatic billionaire investor, was a name that inspired both awe and skepticism. Known for his unconventional methods, he had revived several dying enterprises, but his approach was unpredictable. He often tested not just the financial viability of a company, but the moral fabric of those involved. "I've reached out," Margaret replied. His team was non-committal. "I doubt he'll." Her words were interrupted by the sharp ring of her phone. She picked it up, and after a few terse exchanges, she set it down, her expression unreadable. "That was his assistant. Walter Brooks is considering us." The announcement should have been a glimmer of hope, but there was an unease in the room. Walter's reputation preceded him, and his methods were unorthodox at best. Still, with no other options, the bank's leadership had no choice but to wait. A plan in motion. Miles away, Walter Brooks sat in the study of his sprawling estate, flipping through a file labeled Summit Horizon Bank. The more he read, the more intrigued he became. The bank's history was impressive, and its impact on the local community was undeniable. Yet its downfall was not merely financial. It was rooted in leadership that had lost touch with its principles. Walter believed that money alone couldn't fix a broken institution. Integrity, character, and resilience were the true pillars of any enterprise. To test these qualities, Walter decided on a bold plan. Instead of stepping into the bank as a wealthy benefactor, he would disguise himself as a homeless man seeking assistance. His goal: to gauge the humanity of those running the institution. The transformation. The following morning, Walter stood before a full-length mirror in his walk-in closet. His usual appearance, a tailored suit, polished shoes, and a commanding demeanor, was replaced by something entirely unrecognizable. He wore faded, torn jeans, a threadbare jacket, and scuffed sneakers. His hair was disheveled, and his face bore a scruffy beard. He added smudges to his face and hands for a touch of realism. As he stepped out of his mansion, Walter felt an odd mix of vulnerability and exhilaration. For years, he had been surrounded by luxury, yet today, he would walk the streets as someone society often overlooked. Entering the bank, Walter arrived at Summit Horizon Bank just before noon. The large, glass-fronted entrance reflected the city's bustling streets, but inside, the atmosphere was starkly different. Polished marble floors, sleek furniture, and employees dressed in sharp suits created an aura of professionalism and affluence. As Walter approached the revolving doors, he noticed the security guard, a tall man with a stern face, eyeing him suspiciously. The nameplate on his uniform read Mike. "Hey, buddy," Mike called out, stepping in Walter's path. "You lost. This isn't a shelter." Walter paused, his expression calm. "I'm not lost. I'm here to speak with someone about my account. Mike's brows furrowed, and he crossed his arms. Your account? Look, I think you've got the wrong place. Why don't you? Before he could finish, Walter raised a hand. I'd like to go inside. Are you going to stop me? The firmness in Walter's voice gave Mike pause. After a moment, the guard stepped aside, though his gaze lingered on Walter as he entered. The first encounter. The bank's lobby was abuzz with activity. Customers sat in leather chairs, employees moved briskly between desks, and the sound of clicking keyboards filled the air. Walter approached the reception desk, where a young woman named Emily greeted him with a forced smile. Can I help you? She asked, her tone professional but tinged with discomfort as she took in Walter's appearance. I need to speak with someone about my account, Walter said. Emily hesitated, glancing at her screen. Do you have an appointment? No, Walter replied. But it's important. She frowned, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. After a brief pause, she picked up the phone and spoke in hushed tones. Moments later, a man in a tailored suit approached. His name tag read James Whitaker, branch manager. Sir, James began, his tone polite but condescending. How can I assist you today? Walter studied him for a moment before replying. I'm considering making a substantial deposit, but before I do, I need to know how your bank treats its customers. James blinked, clearly taken aback. A deposit? Of course, we'd be happy to assist. If you'll just... Walter interrupted, his voice steady. Before we discuss money, I'd like to hear about your bank's values. How do you treat people who walk in here, regardless of their appearance? James hesitated, his polished demeanor faltering. We pride ourselves on professionalism and courtesy, he said, though his tone lacked conviction. Good, Walter replied. Because I've got questions, and I'd like honest answers. As the two moved to a private office, Walter couldn't help but notice the wary glances of employees and customers alike. The first test was complete, and the results were mixed. The guard had been dismissive, the receptionist hesitant, and the manager overly rehearsed. Still, Walter wasn't ready to make a judgment. This was only the beginning, a test of character. Inside the office, Walter leaned back in the chair, his casual posture contrasting sharply with James's rigid formality. Tell me, Walter began, what's the bank's mission? James launched into a rehearsed spiel about financial stability, community support, and long-term growth. Walter listened patiently, but noted the lack of genuine passion in his words. Do you believe in what you just said? Walter asked. James faltered. Of course I do. Walter leaned forward, his eyes piercing. Then why does it sound like you're reading off a script? The question hung in the air, and for the first time, James looked uncomfortable. Walter knew he was digging beneath the surface, uncovering the true character of the man before him. And by extension, the institution he represented. This was only the first of many conversations Walter planned to have during his undercover visit. Whether the bank's integrity would stand the test remained to be seen. Beneath the facade, Walter leaned back in the worn office chair, carefully observing James Whitaker, the branch manager. The man's polished suit and practiced smile couldn't mask his unease under Walter's direct scrutiny. The billionaire, still disguised as a homeless man, allowed a few moments of silence to stretch, a tactic he had mastered over decades of negotiation. People revealed their true selves when they struggled to fill the quiet. So, Walter said, breaking the tension, tell me, James, what would you do if someone walked in here needing help but didn't look like your typical customer? James hesitated, his fingers twitching nervously as they hovered over his desk. We treat all our customers with respect and professionalism, he said, the words carefully measured but lacking authenticity. Walter tilted his head, his voice calm but probing. Do you? Because if my experience so far is anything to go by, it seems like appearances speak louder than words in this place. James flushed slightly, a hint of frustration flickering in his eyes. Sir, We have policies in place to ensure fairness. Policies, Walter repeated, his tone laced with skepticism. Policies don't guarantee fairness. People do. And I've been around long enough to know when someone's just checking boxes versus actually living their values. James opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a soft knock at the door interrupted. The receptionist, Emily, poked her head in. "Mr. Whittaker, there's a man here with questions about his mortgage. Should I ask him to wait?" she asked, her eyes flickering nervously to Walter. James sighed, clearly eager to escape the conversation. "Yes, Emily, have him wait. I'll be out shortly." Walter waved a hand. "No need to cut this short on my account. Let me sit in and observe. I'll be quiet, I promise." James looked startled. "That's not typically how we handle things." Walter smiled faintly. "I'm not a typical customer." Reluctantly, James agreed, signaling Emily to send the man in. Moments later, a middle-aged man entered the room, clutching a folder of documents. His face bore the telltale lines of worry, his suit slightly rumpled, as though he had been wearing it for days. A desperate plea. The man introduced himself as Mr. Gerald Thompson, a small business owner struggling to keep his hardware store afloat. "I've been a customer of Summit Horizon for over 20 years, he began, his voice tight with emotion. "But now, with the economy the way it is, I'm falling behind on my mortgage. I came here to see if there's any way to renegotiate the terms or delay payments until I can stabilize things." James straightened in his chair, his demeanor professional but distant. "Mr. Thompson, we appreciate your loyalty to the bank, and I understand this is a difficult time. However, our policies regarding mortgage payments are very clear. Delinquencies are handled through our collections department." Gerald's face fell. "But I'm not asking to skip payments altogether, just for a little time. I've never missed a payment until now, and I'm doing everything I can to turn things around." James nodded sympathetically, but his words were cold. "I understand, but our hands are tied. The bank has procedures in place, and unfortunately, exceptions can't be made." Walter watched the exchange intently, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he leaned forward, addressing Gerald. "Tell me, Mr. Thompson, how has this bank supported your business over the years?" Gerald glanced at Walter, confusion crossing his face at the unexpected question. "They've been fine, I suppose. But when I needed help recently, like increasing my credit line, they declined." "Did they explain why?" Walter pressed. "They said it was too risky," Gerald replied, his voice tinged with bitterness. "I've always paid on time, but the minute things got tough, they turned their backs on me." Walter leaned back again, his gaze shifting to James. "Interesting. A loyal customer, in trouble for the first time, and the best you can offer him is a scripted line about policy." James bristled. "Sir, with all due respect, you don't understand the complexities of running a bank." Walter raised an eyebrow, his tone cool. "Try me. Testing integrity." The room fell silent, the air heavy with tension. Walter, still clad in his tattered disguise, radiated an authority that seemed out of place with his appearance. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. "I get it," Walter continued. "You're under pressure. This bank is barely staying afloat, and bending the rules for one person feels like a risk you can't afford. But let me ask you this. How long do you think this bank will survive if its customers lose faith in its humanity?" James didn't respond, his jaw tightening. Walter turned back to Gerald. "If this bank can't help you, what's your next move?" Gerald sighed heavily. "I don't know. I've already tried other banks, but they're not interested in helping a small business owner like me. If I lose the store, I lose everything." Walter nodded thoughtfully. "And what happens to the community if your store closes?" Gerald's expression darkened. "The town relies on us for hardware and supplies. If we go under, people will have to drive an hour out of town to get what they need." Walter leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. "Do you hear that, James? This isn't just about one man. It's about the ripple effect. When you turn away someone like Gerald, you're not just risking his livelihood. You're risking the trust and stability of the entire community. A chance to reflect. James opened his mouth to reply, but Walter raised a hand to stop him. I'm not asking for a response right now. What I'm asking is for you, and this bank, to take a hard look at what you stand for. Policies are necessary, sure, but if they come at the expense of humanity, they're not worth much, are they? James stared at Walter, his expression a mixture of frustration and curiosity. He clearly didn't know what to make of the man sitting across from him. After a moment, Walter stood, addressing Gerald. Mr. Thompson, thank you for sharing your story. I can't promise anything, but I'll do what I can to make sure it's heard. Gerald gave him a puzzled look but nodded gratefully. As he left the office, James turned to Walter, his tone clipped. I'm not sure who you think you are, but this is highly inappropriate. Walter smiled faintly. You'll know soon enough. A larger plan. As Walter exited the office, he took a slow walk around the bank, observing the interactions between staff and customers. He noted the receptionist's nervous glances, the teller's forced smiles, and the guarded body language of several customers. It was clear that the bank's struggles were affecting everyone, from the employees to the people it served. By the time he stepped back onto the busy streets of Ashtonville, Walter had a clearer picture of Summit Horizon's reality. The bank wasn't just struggling financially, it was losing its soul. And while money could stabilize the balance sheets, it wouldn't fix the deeper issues. For that, Walter had a plan, but it would require more than just his wealth. It would require shaking the very foundation of the bank's culture, one test at a time. The revelation of values. The following day, Walter returned to Summit Horizon Bank. His disheveled appearance and worn clothes were the same as before, but this time he carried a subtle air of purpose. The disguise had done more than hide his identity. It had stripped away the societal privilege he was used to, giving him a clearer view of how the world treated those at its margins. As he pushed open the heavy glass doors, the familiar sound of polished heels clicking against the marble floor greeted him. The receptionist, Emily, glanced up from her desk. Her initial look of surprise quickly morphed into discomfort. Clearly, she hadn't expected to see him again. Good morning. Walter greeted her warmly, ignoring her hesitation. I'd like to speak with Margaret Collins. Emily's expression froze. Margaret Collins, the CEO of Summit Horizon Bank, rarely dealt with walk-in customers, let alone someone who looked like Walter. I'm sorry, she stammered. Ms. Collins isn't available for unscheduled meetings. Walter nodded, as though he had anticipated her response. That's fine. Could you let her know that someone here has urgent business regarding the bank's future? Emily hesitated, her fingers hovering over the phone. Walter's calm demeanor unsettled her, and something about his tone suggested he wasn't a man to be dismissed lightly. Finally, she relented. Please wait here, she said, picking up the receiver. Walter took a seat in the lobby, his eyes scanning the room. He noticed how employees glanced at him from behind their desks, their curiosity laced with unease. For a bank that prided itself on professionalism, its atmosphere was thick with judgment. Meeting the CEO. After a long 20 minutes, Emily returned, her expression flustered. Miss Collins can spare a few minutes. Follow me, please. Walter followed her through a maze of glass-walled offices to a corner suite. Inside, Margaret Collins stood waiting. She was a commanding figure, her tailored suit and poised demeanor radiating authority. Her sharp blue eyes assessed Walter the moment he entered. Good morning, she said, extending her hand. Her tone was polite but guarded. I'm Margaret Collins, CEO of Summit Horizon. To whom do I have the pleasure of speaking? Walter shook her hand firmly. You can call me Walter. Thank you for taking the time to meet with me. Margaret gestured toward a chair. I must admit, Walter, your request was unusual. You mentioned something about the future of the bank. Walter took a seat and leaned back, his posture relaxed. I did, But before we get to that, let me ask you something. What does this bank stand for? Margaret's brows furrowed slightly, but she answered without hesitation. Summit Horizon has always been about fostering trust, providing stability, and supporting our community. Walter smiled faintly. And do you believe it's living up to those ideals? Her expression stiffened. We've faced challenges recently, like any institution during an economic downturn, but our commitment to our values remains steadfast. Walter's eyes searched hers, his gaze unflinching. Let me rephrase the question. If I walked into this bank today as someone struggling to make ends meet, would I feel supported, or would I feel like a burden? Margaret tilted her head, her sharp mind quickly piecing together the subtext of his words. I see, she said slowly. You're not just here to talk about the bank's future. You're here to test its character. Walter didn't confirm or deny her statement. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice taking on a serious tone. Yesterday, I spoke with one of your branch managers, James Whittaker. I watched him dismiss a loyal customer who was desperate for help. I've seen how your employees look at someone like me, as though I don't belong here. So I'll ask you again, what does this bank stand for? Margaret sat back, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. Walter, with all due respect, we can't judge an institution based on isolated interactions. The challenges we face require us to make tough decisions, and not everyone will walk away satisfied. Walter nodded thoughtfully. You're right. Isolated interactions don't tell the whole story, but they do reveal patterns. And the pattern I'm seeing is a bank that's lost its connection to the people it's supposed to serve. A glimpse into Margaret's world. Margaret's composure faltered for a brief moment before she regained her professional demeanor. You're clearly passionate about this, Walter, but let me share something with you. This bank is not just an institution. It's a lifeline for hundreds of employees and thousands of customers. Every decision we make is weighed against the survival of this organization. Walter listened intently. And in the process of saving the organization, have you forgotten the people it's meant to serve? Margaret's jaw tightened. It's not that simple. We're trying to keep the bank afloat. If we fail, the entire community will suffer. Walter leaned back again, his expression calm but piercing. I understand the pressures you're under, but let me tell you something about leadership. It's not just about making the hard decisions. It's about making the right ones. And sometimes, the right decision is taking a risk on someone who needs a hand, even when the numbers don't add up. A test of leadership. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Why are you really here, Walter? You don't strike me as someone who walked in off the street by chance. Walter smiled, the faintest hint of his true identity shining through. Let's just say I have a vested interest in seeing if this bank is worth saving. Margaret's breath caught slightly, and she leaned forward, her gaze scrutinizing him. Are you saying you're a potential investor? Maybe, Walter replied cryptically. But before I put a single cent into this bank, I need to know if it has the character to survive, not just financially, but ethically. Margaret stared at him, her mind racing. The weight of his words began to sink in, and she realized that this wasn't just a meeting with an eccentric customer. This was a test, and the stakes were higher than she had imagined. A challenge issued. Walter rose from his seat, his movements deliberate. Here's what I'll do, Margaret. I'm going to spend a little more time observing how this bank operates, from the teller counters to the back offices. I want to see how your employees treat people, how decisions are made, and whether your values are more than just words on a plaque. Margaret stood as well, her expression a mix of curiosity and wariness. And if you don't like what you see? Walter's smile was faint but firm. Then I'll walk away, and this bank will have to find another way to survive. Before Margaret could respond, Walter turned and headed for the door. As he stepped back into the bustling lobby, he knew he had left the CEO with much to think about. But his work was far from over. The real test was just beginning, and Walter was determined to uncover the true heart of Summit Horizon Bank, whether it was worthy of saving or destined to crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. the hidden pulse of the bank. Walter's next step in his unconventional investigation was to delve deeper into the day-to-day operations of Summit Horizon Bank. He wanted to move beyond the polished facades of management and public relations. The heart of any institution, Walter knew, was found in its people, not just those at the top but the ones on the front lines. Disguised as a homeless man once again, he positioned himself near the bank's customer service desks. For several hours, he simply observed. Employees bustled about, juggling calls, handling inquiries, and occasionally exchanging polite smiles with clients. But Walter wasn't just watching the surface. He was listening, noting tone, body language, and the subtleties of human interaction. The teller's dilemma. Around mid-afternoon, Walter noticed a young teller, Jessica. She looked barely out of college, her name tag slightly crooked on her pristine uniform. Despite her composed appearance, her movements were hesitant, and her face carried an expression of perpetual anxiety. Walter observed her for a while, noting how she handled customers. One customer in particular caught his attention, an elderly woman named Mrs. Greta Whitmore. She approached Jessica's counter with a shaky hand clutching a faded leather purse. Her voice was soft and hesitant. "Dear, I need help with my account," Mrs. Whitmore began. "I received this letter saying I'm overdrawn, but I don't understand. I thought I had enough for my medications." Jessica's eyes darted to the letter, then to the growing line behind Mrs. Whitmore. Walter saw her hesitate. The standard procedure would likely involve referring the woman to another department or giving her a scripted response. But Jessica surprised him. "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore," Jessica said gently. "Let's look into this together. Could I see your account details?" Jessica's colleagues glanced over, their expressions a mix of impatience and disapproval as the line grew longer. Still, Jessica remained focused on Mrs. Whitmore, typing away on her computer. Walter watched as she meticulously reviewed the woman's account, her brow furrowing in concentration. After a few minutes, Jessica looked up. "It seems there was a mistake in processing one of your checks. Let me waive the overdraft fee and make sure your funds are properly allocated. You'll be able to cover your medication, no problem." Mrs. Whitmore's face lit up with relief. "Thank you, dear. You've been so kind." Jessica smiled, her earlier tension melting away. "It's my pleasure, Mrs. Whitmore. If you have any other concerns, don't hesitate to ask." Walter's lips curved into a faint smile. Beneath the bank's struggles and corporate rigidity, there were still employees like Jessica who cared. Her small act of kindness spoke volumes about her character and hinted at the potential the bank could tap into if it nurtured the right values. A different perspective. Later that day, Walter noticed another employee, a middle-aged man named Greg, whose job seemed to involve handling disgruntled customers. Greg's approach was the polar opposite of Jessica's. When a young man approached him to discuss a denied loan application, Greg's tone was curt and dismissive. "I'm sorry," Greg said, not looking up from his computer. "Your credit score doesn't meet our requirements. There's nothing more I can do." The young man, visibly distressed, tried to explain. "But I've been working on my credit for months. I even got a cosigner. Can't you at least take another look?" Greg sighed loudly, finally meeting the young man's gaze. "The system is what it is. If you want to appeal, you'll have to go through the formal process." Next, Walter's jaw tightened as he watched the interaction. Greg's demeanor was emblematic of the very problem plaguing the bank, a reliance on rigid policies over empathy and understanding. While Jessica's actions had left him hopeful, Greg's behavior reminded him of why so many institutions like Summit Horizon were struggling. A chance encounter with the custodian. As Walter continued his observations, he decided to explore other parts of the bank. While wandering down a hallway, he bumped into an elderly custodian named Arthur. Arthur was pushing a cleaning cart laden with supplies, whistling a cheerful tune despite the stress-filled atmosphere of the building. "Need help finding something?" Arthur asked, his tone friendly. "Just looking around," Walter replied with a grin. "You've been here long?" 35 years, Arthur said proudly. Seen this place through thick and thin. Back in the day, it was different. Felt more like a family than a corporation. What changed? Walter asked, genuinely curious. Arthur sighed, leaning on his mop. The world got faster, colder. People started caring more about numbers than faces. But you can still find good folks here, like Jessica at the front desk. She reminds me of how things used to be, always going the extra mile for people. Walter nodded, his respect for Arthur growing. And what about the leadership? Do they care? Arthur chuckled, shaking his head. They care about keeping the lights on, sure. But about the people? I don't know. Feels like they're more worried about stock prices than making this a place people can trust. The unexpected ally. Walter's next stop was the employee break room, a modest space with a coffee machine, a small fridge, and a few scattered chairs. As he stood near the doorway, pretending to adjust his shoelace, he overheard a conversation between two employees. One of them, a woman named Linda, was venting to her colleague. I swear, if management asks us to do one more thing to boost efficiency, I'm going to lose it. They don't get how stretched we already are. Her colleague nodded. It's all about optics. They're so focused on looking good to investors that they've forgotten the people who actually keep this place running. Walter's ears perked up. These employees, though frustrated, were offering valuable insight into the disconnect between management and staff. He made a mental note to address this issue later. A glimmer of hope. By the end of the day, Walter had a clearer picture of Summit Horizon Bank's strengths and weaknesses. There were employees like Jessica and Arthur who embodied the values the bank claimed to stand for. But there were also individuals like Greg, whose lack of compassion highlighted the institutional flaws dragging the organization down. Walter realized that the bank's survival would require more than just financial investment. It would need a cultural shift, one that reconnected its leadership with the people it served. For that to happen, Margaret Collins and her team would need to confront uncomfortable truths about their priorities. As Walter left the bank that evening, he felt both the weight of the challenge ahead and a flicker of hope. Beneath the layers of bureaucracy and corporate rigidity, Summit Horizon still had a beating heart. All it needed was the right spark to reignite its purpose, and Walter intended to provide it. Cracks in the foundation. Walter Brooks, still cloaked in the guise of an unassuming homeless man, stood outside Summit Horizon Bank early the next morning. The day promised to be pivotal. He had spent enough time observing the institution from the inside, understanding its culture, and witnessing firsthand its treatment of people, both employees and customers. Now, it was time to escalate his investigation. Walter's plan was simple: push the bank's leadership and staff to confront the very cracks threatening to collapse the institution. To do so, he would need to test them in ways they could not anticipate. The customer complaint escalation. Walter entered the bank during its morning rush. The lobby was bustling with customers, employees darting back and forth, and the faint hum of printers and clicking keyboards filling the air. He approached the reception desk, where Emily, the receptionist, greeted him with her now familiar mix of politeness and discomfort. "Good morning, Walter," she said cautiously. "What brings you in today?" "I need to speak to James Whittaker," Walter replied firmly. "It's urgent." Emily hesitated but eventually made the call. Within minutes, James appeared, his polished demeanor masking his irritation at seeing Walter again. "Walter," James said, his voice tight, "what can I help you with today?" Walter didn't mince words. "There's a woman here, Mrs. Greta Whitmore. She's being charged unnecessary fees, and I want to make sure they're waived." James blinked, clearly caught off guard. "I wasn't aware of that situation. But if there's an issue, I'm sure our customer service team can handle it." Walter's gaze was unyielding. Customer service shouldn't be the first line of defense when it comes to treating people with respect. "I watched Mrs. Whitmore struggle yesterday. Do you think that reflects well on this bank?" James's face flushed slightly. "Walter, I appreciate your concern, but we can't make exceptions for every customer." Policies exist for a reason. Walter nodded slowly. And if those policies are driving away the very people who trust this institution with their livelihoods, then maybe the policies need to change. Their conversation drew the attention of nearby customers and employees. Walter could see the discomfort spreading through the room, but he pressed on. "I've been here long enough to see how this bank operates," Walter continued. "And let me tell you, your values are eroding. If you're not careful, you won't just lose customers, you'll lose everything." James stared at him, speechless. The tension in the room was palpable. The employee's breaking point. Walter left James fuming in the lobby and headed toward the employee break room, a space he had observed the previous day. He knew the employees were the backbone of the institution, and their perspectives could illuminate the deeper challenges Summit Horizon faced. Inside, he found Jessica, the young teller who had helped Mrs. Whitmore, sitting with Linda, the frustrated employee he'd overheard earlier. They were mid-conversation, but stopped abruptly when Walter entered. "Mind if I join you?" he asked with a smile. Jessica looked uncertain, but Linda gestured for him to sit. "Why not? You're already the talk of the bank," she said dryly. Walter chuckled, appreciating her candor. "Good. Maybe it's time people started talking about the right things." Linda raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Like how this place is suffocating under its own weight," Walter said, his tone serious. "I've seen how hard you all work, and I've also seen how little support you get from the top. Tell me, how often does leadership actually listen to you?" Jessica exchanged a glance with Linda before answering. "Not often," she admitted. "They talk about efficiency and cost-cutting, but never ask how those decisions affect us or our customers." Linda nodded. "We're stretched so thin that even small mistakes can spiral into major problems. But instead of addressing the root causes, they just add more layers of bureaucracy." Walter leaned forward, his eyes intent. "And do you think the bank can survive like this?" Linda's expression darkened. "Not for long. Morale's at an all-time low. People are quitting left and right, and the ones who stay are too burnt out to care." Jessica hesitated, then added softly, "But it doesn't have to be this way. If leadership really cared, if they showed us they were willing to fight for the people, not just the profits, it could make all the difference." Walter nodded, her words resonating deeply. He saw the flicker of hope in Jessica's eyes and knew that employees like her were the bank's greatest asset. But they needed to be empowered, not stifled. The test of true leadership. By mid-afternoon, Walter had made his way to the executive floor. The air here was different, quieter, more calculated. The walls were adorned with framed photos of past CEOs and awards celebrating the bank's achievements. But Walter couldn't help but feel the weight of history pressing down on the present. He entered Margaret Collins's office unannounced, his boldness catching her by surprise. She was seated at her desk, reviewing a thick stack of documents. "Walter," she said, looking up, "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." "I've been busy," he replied, taking a seat without waiting for an invitation. "And so have you, I imagine." Margaret sighed, setting her papers aside. "What is it this time?" Walter didn't mince words. "Your bank is dying, Margaret, not just financially but morally. And if you want to save it, you're going to have to start leading differently." Her eyes narrowed. "What do you mean by that?" "I've seen enough to know where the problems lie," Walter said. "Your policies are rigid, your employees are overworked and undervalued, and your leadership is out of touch with the people it's supposed to serve. If you don't address these issues, no amount of money will save this place." Margaret's face hardened. "Do you think I don't know that? Do you think I haven't spent sleepless nights trying to figure out how to keep this bank alive?" "I believe you care," Walter said evenly. "But caring isn't enough. You need to act. And not just to protect the bottom line. You need to rebuild trust, both within your team and with your customers." Margaret leaned back in her chair, her expression conflicted. "And how do you propose I do that?" Walter smiled faintly. "Start by listening. Your employees have ideas, solutions even, but they're drowning in bureaucracy. Empower them. And as for your customers, show them that this bank values their trust more than their fees. It won't be easy, but it's the only way forward. An unveiling of intentions. Margaret studied Walter for a long moment before speaking. You've been awfully invested in this, Walter. More than any customer I've ever met. Why? Walter met her gaze, his expression steady. Because this bank has potential. It has good people like Jessica and Arthur, who still believe in its purpose. But it's losing its way, and if I can help set it back on the right path, I will. Margaret frowned. And who are you to think you can do that? Walter stood, his voice calm but resolute. You'll find out soon enough. But for now, consider this. Survival isn't just about money. It's about character. If you can lead with that in mind, Summit Horizon has a chance. As he walked out of her office, Walter felt the weight of the day's encounters settling over him. The bank was at a crossroads, and its fate rested not just on the shoulders of its leadership, but on every employee, customer, and decision-maker. Whether it would rise or fall would depend on their willingness to embrace the values they claim to uphold. For Walter, the real test was just beginning. The reckoning. The air inside Summit Horizon Bank was tense. Word of Walter's persistent presence and his sharp, probing questions had spread among the employees, sparking a mixture of curiosity and anxiety. Whispers rippled through the ranks. Who was this man? Was he a disgruntled customer, a journalist, or someone else entirely? Most dismissed him as a troublemaker, while a few, like Jessica and Arthur, saw him as a voice for change. Walter knew the time had come to reveal his true purpose. But before that, there was one final test he needed to conduct, one that would put Summit Horizon's leadership, employees, and very culture under the spotlight. The meeting in the boardroom. Margaret Collins, the CEO, had called for an emergency all-staff meeting in the bank's largest conference room. The agenda was vague, but the tension was palpable. Walter, still dressed in his disguise, entered the room quietly, taking a seat at the back. No one seemed to notice him amidst the flurry of suits and professional chatter. Margaret stood at the head of the room, her usual composure showing cracks. Beside her was James Whittaker, the branch manager, looking uneasy. The rest of the board members sat to her right, their faces a mix of frustration and skepticism. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, Margaret began, her voice steady but lacking its usual confidence. We're here to address some of the challenges our bank is facing. Over the past few weeks, we've received feedback from customers and employees alike. While we've always prided ourselves on being the cornerstone of this community, it's clear we've fallen short of our mission. There was a murmur in the room. Margaret raised a hand for silence. Today, we'll be discussing how we can rebuild trust, not just with our customers, but among ourselves. And to help us do that, I'd like to introduce someone who's been closely observing our operations. Margaret gestured toward the back of the room, and all eyes turned to Walter. The room fell silent as he stood and walked to the front. His ragged clothes and unkempt appearance clashed starkly with the pristine professionalism of the gathering, but his presence commanded attention. "Good morning," Walter began, his voice calm but firm. "I'm sure many of you are wondering who I am and why I've been here. My name is Walter Brooks." Gasps rippled through the room. The name was instantly recognizable. A billionaire investor known for rescuing struggling companies. Whispers erupted as realization dawned. Walter continued, his tone unwavering. "For the past week, I've been here, disguised as someone society often overlooks. I wanted to see how this bank operates, not through polished presentations or rehearsed speeches, but through the way it treats people. And what I've seen has been revealing." The results of the test. Walter turned to face the employees, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Let me start with the positives. People like Jessica, who went out of her way to help a customer in need, embody the values this bank claims to uphold. Arthur, your custodian of 35 years, is a living reminder of the community spirit this institution was built on. Jessica's face turned bright red as her colleagues glanced her way. Arthur, who stood at the back, gave a humble nod. "But," Walter said, his voice hardening, "I've also seen the cracks. I've seen employees who are burned out, frustrated, and unsupported. I've watched loyal customers turned away because policies prioritize profits over people. And I've witnessed a leadership team so consumed by survival that it's forgotten what this bank was meant to stand for." James shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening. Walter turned to Margaret. "This isn't just a financial crisis, Margaret. It's a crisis of character. And unless you address it head-on, no amount of money will save this bank." Margaret nodded, her expression somber. "I understand, Walter. But what would you have us do?" "The path to redemption." Walter stepped closer, his voice filled with conviction. "First, you need to empower your employees. They're the ones on the front lines, interacting with customers and keeping this place running. Listen to them. Give them the tools and support they need to succeed." He turned to the employees. "And for you, don't wait for permission to do the right thing. Jessica didn't. Arthur hasn't. Be the change this bank needs, even when it's hard." Walter faced Margaret again. "Second, reconnect with your community. This bank was once a lifeline for people, but somewhere along the way, it became just another institution. Host town halls, meet with your customers, and find out what they need, not what looks good on paper. And finally," Walter said, his voice rising, "lead with integrity. Every decision you make, every policy you enforce, should be guided by one question. Is this in the best interest of the people we serve? If the answer is no, then you're not just failing your customers, you're failing yourselves." The room was silent, the weight of Walter's words sinking in. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Margaret stepped forward. "Walter," she said, her voice steady, "if we commit to these changes, if we rebuild this bank the right way, will you help us?" Walter's gaze softened. "I already have. My team has been reviewing your financials. If you're willing to take these steps, not just on paper, but in practice, I'll invest the capital you need to stabilize this bank." A wave of relief swept through the room, followed by scattered applause. But Walter raised a hand to silence it. "This isn't just about money," he said. "It's about proving that Summit Horizon Bank can be what it was meant to be, a place where people matter. The real work starts now." The ripple effect. Over the following months, Summit Horizon Bank underwent a transformation. Margaret implemented a new leadership structure, one that included employees from all levels in decision-making. Town halls became regular events, fostering open dialogue between the bank and its customers. Policies were revised to prioritize fairness and empathy, and employee training programs emphasized the importance of integrity. Jessica was promoted to a senior role in customer service, recognized for her commitment to the bank's values. Arthur, the custodian, became a beloved figure in the community outreach program, sharing stories of the bank's history and its renewed mission. Walter remained involved, not as a distant investor, but as a mentor, guiding the leadership team through the challenges of change. Slowly but surely, the bank's reputation began to recover, and with it, the trust of the community. The legacy restored. 1 year later, Walter stood outside the bank, now bearing a new slogan on its facade, "Where people come first." He watched as customers entered and exited, their expressions a mix of familiarity and hope. Jessica, now confident in her new role, waved to him through the glass. Arthur approached, pushing his cart as always. "Looks like your plan worked," he said with a grin. Walter nodded, a rare smile gracing his face. "It wasn't my plan, Arthur. It was theirs. I just reminded them of what they already knew." As Walter walked away, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Summit Horizon Bank had been saved, not just as a business, but as a symbol of what could happen when people chose integrity over profit, compassion over complacency. It was a lesson not just for the bank, but for the world, and one that Walter knew he would carry into his next venture.